Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Mike Dickey, founding partner of Nova.
Well, good morning and welcome back, everyone.
Morning.
So it's my great honor this morning to be able to sit in front of you here today with Mr. Tory Bruno, President and CEO of United Launch Alliance, and talk a little bit more about launch and maybe riff on some of the themes that General Panzenhagen brought
Absolutely.
up. Let me give you a little bit of the Tory story. Born in Monterey, California, to a commercial fisherman. It's been an interesting childhood. Went to Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, mechanical engineering degree, and then started his early career at Lockheed Martin in the ballistic missile programs. I thought, it's unfortunately what hits the internet never leaves the internet, right? So I saw some stuff on the internet about you that I got to ask.
Uh-oh.
It says that when you were a youngster, and maybe so this is charting your course for the future. Maybe you knew early, but you took some 80-year-old dynamite you found in a barn, cut it open with your pocket knife, and built solid rocket motors. What made you think that might be a good idea?
Well, I was 8 or 10 years old, and the moon program was still a pretty big thing. And so, after Monterey, I grew up on a ranch up in the Sierras. It was already 100 years old. And so when I was rooting around in the back of the barn and I found a case of dynamite, I couldn't think of anything more useful to do with it. So there was some old wrought iron pipe, and there was the dynamite. I still remember pretty clearly to this day that it was August, it's dry, and I was struck by, why is this dynamite all wet? And for those of you who aren't familiar with dynamite, it's usually paper or diatomaceous earth, and then you soak it, you pack it with nitroglycerin, like in the cowboy movies. And when it gets old like that, it just sweats out. And if you sneeze hard or you drop it, you're dead. And but I didn't, and I'm proud to say that some of my rockets made it a little ways into the sky before they detonated. And I'm still here, and I got 10 fingers.
Yeah, we're glad you didn't detonate, or we wouldn't be having this conversation. But probably, to your great delight, Lockheed Martin puts you in the ordnance division of the propulsion department. So they saw that talent in you with the dynamite and put you there. But my guess is that they saw other things in you, and you would have loved to have stayed doing ordnance work, but you couldn't. Yeah, now you get into management and leadership. So a full career at Lockheed doing all things ballistic missiles, missile defense, all things rockets, which put him in a great position in 2014 to become the president and CEO of United Launch Alliance. And I think you brought a video that tells us what you get to do every day.
All right.
So let's roll the video.
At ULA, we launch rockets. With 100% success, we design and build rockets to launch spacecraft that no other company can. All rockets are not created equal. And as the industry's most experienced, reliable, and accurate launch provider, ULA delivers unmatched value. We show up every day ready to save lives, explore the universe, and connect the world. And with the introduction of the Vulcan rocket, ULA enters a new era of space capabilities with higher performance, greater affordability, and the world's only high-energy architecture rocket. Delivering any payload at any time to any orbit, our tireless drive to improve and our commitment to the extraordinary is what makes us ULA.
Okay.
All right, very cool.
Smoke and fire.
So 10 years on in your time at the helm, a lot has changed since 2014. I think I looked up in 2014, there were about 75 launches worldwide. Mm-hmm. General Panzenhagen just said we're in the 220s in 2024.
Yep.
And going higher. So there's a lot of reasons for that. It's advancement of technology. It's the threat has required us to launch more, and also the commercial maturation of the commercial space economy. So what in your 10 years? How do you characterize that change? And conversely, what has stayed the same about putting payloads into
Oh,
space?
sure. Well, the change is actually pretty straightforward. I mean, it's a simple matter of the demand going way up. The government missions have only increased modestly. The traditional commercial telecom industry, which is geosats for the most part, have remained flat. It is all about proliferated LEO and the new marketplace of providing low latency, high bandwidth internet. That's where the growth has come from. And you know what that has changed is to put just a tremendous amount of volume through the national launch sites, through Cape Canaveral and through Vandenberg. They were never imagined for this variety of launch vehicles, and they were never designed for this volume. So it's been a big challenge. Hats off to the Space Force and to General Pansenhagen for managing that. On the other side of that, you know, what stays the same? Well, irregardless of how many of these things you launch, it remains a very technically challenging endeavor. Not just space launch, but space launch in total. And it is a very, in the business world, we say capital intensive business, but in plain English, it is an infrastructure intensive activity. The launch pads are large and they are complex. They're big cryogenic chemical facilities with amazing amounts of data collected on them. They are more complicated than the rockets they fly. I know that's counterintuitive, but it's true. And safety, of course, is paramount. When you saw a picture of a Vulcan, fully loaded, that's 2.5 million pounds of high explosive propellant. General Pansenhagen talked about how we like to fly out over water right away. I think the reason for that should be pretty clear. So all of that is the nature of the business and the endeavor that doesn't change. The other thing that doesn't change is what it's really all about. You know, far and away the majority of those launches you just talked about are commercial. The government encouraged us all to do that. I'm doing it as well in our business. And why did they? Because the commercial work brings infrastructure expansion. As we face into our challenge with China and Russia, but especially China, that's just critically important that we have that depth and breadth. But fundamentally, this is still ultimately about national security. And even when the majority of your launches are for a commercial customer, you still have to remember that you are entrusted with a national mission, with our own national security, and it is a sacred duty. And the reason you are doing all of these commercial launches is not just to have a healthy business, but to also support that. So it's different than other commercial work. It's a privilege to do this work, and you can never forget it.
Thank you. Everybody wants to build rockets because rockets are cool, right? I happen to be married to a rocket scientist. I think rocket scientists are cool too. I'm biased.
Me too. My whole family, my wife, my son, my daughter, my son-in-law. It is the nerdiest Thanksgiving any of you can ever imagine.
I can attest.
We have long debates about propulsion technology. It's the best thing ever.
Hopefully, as a good father, you kept them away from the dynamite.
Yeah, you know.
But so a couple of years ago, I think I saw a number. There were like 162 self-declared, rocket launch companies, almost all of which didn't have a rocket or had ever launched a rocket. But you can see that, and to kind of get to that cadence and everything that's coming. So, and again, to hit on the kind of infrastructure. So that's kind of the boring part, right? People don't want to do infrastructure stuff. General Pansenhagen said she had to get $1.3 billion of passback money to be able to spend on the infrastructure. So in that world of this high cadence and different kinds of rockets, and now we're even bringing stuff back and landing it. So from an operations perspective, as a launch operator at the ranges, what are those considerations and how do you deal with that?
Yeah, so we'll go back to what we talked about a minute ago, and I'll just say that that was a great discussion from her, and I'll give you a feel for what I touched on a moment ago in terms of what that commercial business brings to that. I put over $1.5 billion into infrastructure. Some of that into the rocket, but most of it into factories, supply chain, the launch pads being rebuilt. I will tell you right now, as a little outside our swim lane in this room, but as the country is, replacing its ICBM force and modernizing its SLBM force, which are entirely solid propulsion vehicles because that's appropriate for a missile, that all by ourselves, entirely with private investment out in Utah, we have quadrupled the national capacity for large solid rocket motors. That's what having the commercial work has enabled relative to the national security imperative. So, as we get out on the range, it's, like I said a minute ago, it is way more volume than it's ever been before. And I'll just say it one more time, far and away, the majority of these launches are private businesses for commercial uses. That will only grow as I come online with my Kuiper missions. That percentage will grow. And what we want to do is continue to encourage that because of the benefits I just talked about. But remember what the ranges are there for. Those are public facilities for national security and for exploration. And we need to make sure that those missions continue to have the highest priority and that if push comes to shove, that a critical national security space mission goes first. And that we are doing the right thing for our warfighters in the field and recognizing that we are in another Cold War. It's a little bit, I think, surprising to people to think about it that way, but it is, and it's on. It was like this back in the 50s. There wasn't a light switch where somebody said, oh, we're facing off against Soviet Union. It kind of snuck up on us. That's where we are now with China. And we're going to look at those assets through that lens. And we got to make smart decisions. The Space Force needs to decide which services are going to be provided through the ranges and which services we're going to ask providers to put onto their pads all by themselves. And what I mean by smart is ultimately, customers pay for all that infrastructure sooner or later. And it's not very efficient for every pad to replicate everything it uses. Some of those services are much more efficiently provided for the entire facility, and so it ought to be done that way.
Right. Let me pull the national security thread a little bit. So we're 5 years on from the birth of the Space Force. When that was starting to come about, for shortly after they stood up, they published what they call a Space Capstone publication, which is an interesting story in and of itself. It was a group of young space airmen who got together, self-organized, got together and sort of wrote down some fundamental truths about what it means to be a military service, protecting and defending the space domain. And you don't see space launch referenced in that. What you see is this concept of their core competency being space access, mobility, and logistics, or SAML, right? And that's a much more expansive concept. I want to get some of the words right here. It includes the movement and support from Earth into the domain, from the domain back to Earth, and within the space domain. And it includes not only space launch, but also dynamic maneuver, sustainment, even technology upgrades on orbit. So how are you approaching that? And with Vulcan, what are you thinking about as the Space Force is moving in that direction?
Yeah, I've been working on that since I got to ULA. So, I'll be open and direct with everyone. Right now we have half a strategy. Okay, we have a strategy built around resilience. Resilience was the first and highest priority thing we needed to give our space assets, and by that, in plain English, we anticipate we're going to be attacked. We know that the Chinese are going to come after us in space, not as something that escalated from a terrestrial conflict into space, but I think we now pretty much know a major terrestrial conflict starts in space, and they know how dependent we are. And so the first thing to do was to have assets that could take some hits and have a few losses and continue to do their mission. Take a punch and keep on doing your thing. What resiliency is really for, though, is to buy a window of time through that capability during which you make them stop shooting at you. You have to have counterforce. You will never build more targets than they can build bullets. And so today we're in a pretty good position in terms of resiliency. It's not done, but we have programs in place. The Space Force has a strategy and it's being executed. It's time to have the other things you talked about. It's time to be able to move through space at will and to be able to defend ourselves when we are attacked. Then we'll truly be able to deter that aggression in space, which in turn deters an attack on the ground. So when I said we've been working on it, it's because I've had that vision for day one, the ability to have a platform that is lightning fast, long range, and if necessary, very lethal. Those aren't satellites. Satellites are slow and deliberate in their motion. A satellite has to go up on a launch vehicle. It has to meet the mass constraints and volume constraints there. What I've been working on is essentially a rocket that operates in space. So that as we watch an attack developing where a Chinese asset is spending a few days or a week approaching something we care about, we have something we can move there in a few hours and interrupt that attack before it starts, and if necessary, remove their assets off the board. So that's what I think we need to round out the strategy, and I've been working on it a long time, and you're going to start seeing stuff.
Excellent, exciting. Important for the guardians in the room to start putting that capability in their hands and practicing. So as you make upgrades, you're building a new rocket. We went through this big disruption in 2020 called COVID, and the disruption was largely in a globalized supply chain.
Yeah.
A lot of lessons from the business world on what to do to rectify that. What were the lessons that you learned in your position, and what are you doing about that?
Yeah, I'll say first that we weren't hit as hard as a lot of people because our heritage focus has been on national security, so our supply chain was largely domestic. I only had a couple of places where we go to a close ally to buy things, but what I did observe coming through COVID was the culmination of a longer-term problem we've wrung our hands about in the defense industry for quite some time. Those of you who have been at this a while will have heard the phrase, there's a gray tsunami coming where, the defense industry technologists are late in their career and they're going to hit retirement eligibility and they're all going to retire at once, and then we won't have that depth anymore. That didn't happen. People don't, they're not like that little button on the Thanksgiving turkey that pops out all of a sudden when it's at the right temperature. They don't hit 55 and everybody retires. It doesn't work that way. It kind of blended out. COVID did push it over the edge. And I saw that hit in the defense supply chain first, where the folks there had less technical depth and breadth, I would say. I think the government is coming next along with the big primes. We were in a better position, but really only in a way by luck. When I came to ULA, my job was to transform it to be in a new competitive environment, because the launch industry was growing up around us and we could have that, which is good for the nation. But part of that involved restructuring the company, and it also involved a significant layoff way back in 2016. Literally, we downsized by a third of our workforce. And having been concerned about, this issue for a long time, that was an opportunity and I seized it. So it was the last thing we did. We did everything else around restructuring the business first. And during that time, we researched and sort of designed the ideal workforce, right? The ideal distribution of experience. How many very senior people, how many people in the middle, and then how many people at the front end of the pipeline, which skills, which people. And so as we went through that reduction, we drove that curve to that ideal state. We had a voluntary or an incentivized layoff, really retirement for our senior folks. about 68% of the departures were done that way, but we controlled it. So I was determined not to pay someone to go away that I wanted to stay, basically. And when we had people put their hand up and said, hey, I want to go, I was going to retire, I was keeping it a secret, but I was going to retire like next year or the year after, but now I can afford to do it now, we'd say, that's great, we'll give you that, but if you want that, you can't go right now. I need you for another year or two, and I need you to do two things. You got to train 2 people into the pipeline to be ready to grow into your job, and generally there was a milestone. You know, if it was a person developing something on Vulcan, we needed them to finish. And we made them do it, and we made it independently verified before they left. But that allowed me to do that shaping. And I think that was, I mean, I just be honest with you, yeah, I was thinking about it, but thinking about it doesn't do you any good unless you have the opportunity. And we were just lucky to have that. I don't think very many other primes have had that chance. So rolling forward, we really got to pay attention to it. You can't develop people on academic stuff. You have to have real work for them to do to really learn their skills. And we have to deliberately search for that.
So, you know, it's interesting you talk about that transformation. So the Space Force is not restructuring, but structuring. They're trying to create something new, I guess restructured out of the Air Force. But, you know, as a leader of a big organization, lessons through that experience that you might pass on of how you create and shift the culture to the place you want, shape the workforce, all those things you're talking about. What's your recommendations?
Yeah, I will. But first I'm going to comment on when General Saltzman talked about that. I was backstage listening to him. I'm going to disagree with him a little bit. And, you know, he talked about being a small organization, and I don't think he talked about it as much, but I will. I think it makes the Space Force more agile, and in a way can be a little bit more choosy about who they get. So that's a good thing. He also talked about wanting some relief on how to manage it, because it is a small organization. That's also good. But what he didn't say is, you're just a little too small. You got big challenges in front of you as a Space Force, and I think you should be a little bit bigger. And when I talk to folks on the Hill, I express that as well. But, you know, in terms of, you know, back to your question for a minute, you know, you have to have a strategy at the beginning. You got to keep it simple. Everybody in your organization has to understand it. It's got to be simple enough for them to keep it in their head and to know what it means. But it's like every other thing like that. It'll say easy, but it'll do hard. And so you have to have leadership courage to get through it, because there will be 10 opportunities every day to veer off course or give up. The challenges are difficult. Some of that work is damned unpleasant, and you just got to stick it out, and you got to get through the other side. And then maybe the last thing I would advise people in that situation is that, like as we talked about a moment ago, the human capital is the most valuable thing. It is the easiest to break. It is the hardest to replace. It's the most valuable thing you have. Even in a business like I just described at the beginning in launch, where you have billion-dollar pieces of infrastructure, all of that stuff is absolutely worthless if you don't have people who know how to use it and operate it. So don't ever forget that.
So, yeah, great advice. We're here 10 years into your tenure. Last question I'll ask you is, if we're back here, hopefully they invite us back and you don't play with dynamite, 10 years from now, what do you think this looks like? Great power competition, commercial?
Yeah. Well, first off, I'll be here. I mean, it's a lot harder to get dynamite now. The ATF gets all fussy about it, you know, blowing stuff up. So it's going to be different. You know, we're going to have a robust launch industry. I'll start there. You talked about the 165 micro launchers once upon a time. I went to their conference in Santa Clara, and I sat on a panel, and I told them, there'll be 3 of you 10 years from now, and they booed me. I think there's maybe 4, so I was off by a little bit. There's going to be 3 heavy lift providers. There's going to be 2 medium small lift people because us heavy guys, really me, I abandoned the Delta II class. When we pegged Vulcan for the most difficult national security launches, the very high mass direct inject GSO kind of lifts, that set us over here, and in one vehicle it wasn't practical to do the small launch mission anymore. So that's empty, and that void will be filled by 1 or 2 guys. So think Atlas 401, Delta II. There will be 1 or 2 micro launchers still. So that'll be the industry, and that's plenty. And there'll be enough launches to go for everybody. There'll be competition, and I think the competition will be healthy so long as the government is smart about it. You want a broad industrial base when you're facing into a challenge like China because you need the bandwidth. You want healthy competition because that allows that industrial base to invest in innovative technologies and disruptive capabilities, which is ultimately what will win that conflict. We'll not prevail over China through mass. We will prevail over them through superior technology. So that's very important. I think I should probably take a minute and talk about what healthy competition means, because there is unhealthy competition. You know, if you don't have enough missions to make them viable businesses, that's not healthy. If you have businesses that are carbon copies of one another in terms of what service or product they provide, that's unhealthy. You want a little bit of overlap so that they are competing with each other and investing in R&D and coming up with cool capabilities. But if you make them exactly the same, then in the business world, we call that a race to the bottom. The only thing they can do is to try and drive costs down. When they get to the bottom part of that curve, pretty soon they're stripping everything out. There's no R&D, there's no development, there's no investment in infrastructure. The first company that hits scale above the other companies will then take over, and a couple of years later you got a monopoly and you've lost everything you wanted to have in a broad industrial base. So I have faith that we're smart in this country and we understand the great power that we have is the partnership between private industry and government. We'll do this right. We'll have that kind of launch field. We'll have the same kind of thing in our spacecraft providers. China will be back on its heels. It will be deterred from aggression because we'll have the capabilities I discussed, and they will be looking for the next asymmetric thing to do to us, and we'll be thinking about how to counter that. This is now great power competition. It's going to go on for a couple decades, and it's not a static playing field. So every day you should spend a little bit of time thinking about what Mike just asked me, because we're going to counter them, and then they're going to come up with something new, and we got to counter that too.
Well, we thank you for what you're doing, the men and women at United Launch Alliance, what they're doing for our national security. I hope Space Force Association allows us to come back 10 years on and talk about it some more. Ladies and gentlemen, Torrey Bruno.
Thank you all.